So one of the great things about the sex worker rights movement is not only have we developed this national movement, but there's a large international movement. And a couple of years ago, I had the rare, good privilege to be able to travel to Australia to attend and this is the actual title of it because we're crazy, an international convening of Commonwealth and former Commonwealth countries campaigners for the decriminalization of sex work. So, and that's where I first got to meet Catherine Healey in person, as well as activists from all over the world. It was an amazing experience. And sex worker activists are incredibly generous with one another. Catherine has traveled to Canada, I'm not sure how many times in the last year, to talk about the New Zealand model, and we're really, really glad to have her tonight. She is the founding member and now national coordinator of the New Zealand Prostitutes Collective. She's also a former member of the government-appointed Prostitution Law Review Committee and co-editor of Taking the Crime Out of Sex Work. Catherine has played a key role in the design and implementation of the laws that decriminalize sex work in New Zealand in 2003 and is a former sex worker herself. So please join me in giving her a warm welcome.
Thank you everyone for bringing me here. I feel very honoured to be in Vancouver, and I know that you've faced your difficulties, and our heart went out to you through the Picton period. But our heart also goes out to you at this point in time because I think a serious mistake's about to be made. New Zealand's a small country at the bottom of the world, and we're very insignificant. Australians tell us this. But needless to say, we were the country that first achieved suffrage in 1993, and my claim to fame is 100 years on from that occasion, I was awarded a suffrage medal by our Queen for providing services to women. You know, of course, I was providing services to men as well. But I also need to acknowledge, to save explaining what's on my wrist, that our other claim to fame indeed is The Hobbit. Someone came into our community centre with a big basket of trinkets and said, "Don't tell Peter." Not true, no. I'm sure they were genuine and they were offcuts, but indeed I have an elfin trinket on my wrist which was donated from Weta Workshops. I'll auction it off if you like. It's 11 years on since New Zealand decriminalised sex work. And what does that mean to you, and what does that mean to me? Well, to me, it meant 15 years of advocacy, pushing, holding my breath with my colleagues in sex work, thinking, we're going to make it. Someone's going to see it's common sense to give us our rights. We got the vote through in 2003 by one vote. We had a lot of support, though, building up to it. We had support right across the sector in terms of women's organisations. The National Council on Women, the YWCA, the Young Women's Christian Association, the Business and Professional Women's Federation, our major Indigenous women's group, the Māori Women's Welfare League, supported us. We didn't always agree, and we certainly had our debates, quite nuanced. One of the trickier debates was around what to do with youth. But where people came in on was the fact that sex workers' lives needed to be improved, that there was no point in making everything illegal, which it was. Very similar to what your laws were. We had brothel keeping legislation that sent us to prison for 5 years. We had living on the earnings that sent us to prison for 7. Soliciting the act of asking someone for money for sex was a $200 penalty, but it did mean that you had a conviction, and that conviction did mean it stayed with you for life. A conviction for prostitution, not very groovy. If you're serious about supporting sex workers and their rights, you would be serious about changing the law and ensuring that would be the case. It was never against the law in New Zealand for clients to pay for sex. And fortunately, we never really had that debate in any serious way at that time, prior to 2003. Our politicians, I think, were afraid to raise it in case there was a fair bit of finger wagging. So it's been interesting, 11 years on, to reflect on how we got there and what the changes mean. Our definition of decriminalisation of sex work means that all the legislation that pertained to adult sex work or adult prostitution was repealed. Goodbye to brothel keeping, which I think you have a different name. I think you call it bawdy housekeeping, which we always thought was rather romantic. Living on the earnings, procuring, hiring someone into prostitution, and soliciting, all those laws were repealed and are no longer on the statute books. We felt we had to be realistic, nevertheless, in talking about legislation, while many of us wanted to just see the adult laws repealed and left alone and allow for sex workers to be surrounded by all the other good legislation that exists. The politicians felt they needed something tangible to market to the public, so we do now have what's called the Prostitution Reform Act. The aims of the Prostitution Reform Act are to safeguard the human right of sex workers and protect them from exploitation. So right at the top, the first aim is to safeguard the human rights of sex workers. Who would have thought? The second is to promote the welfare and occupational health and safety of sex workers. The third is to be conducive to public health. And the fourth, to prohibit the use of prostitution of persons under 18 years of age. Very important aims, and they've stood us in good stead, although I imagine you could add to those. So what this means, for a lot of sex workers, there's more choice. When I was a sex worker, of course, we weren't allowed to be sex workers. We had to pretend to be masseuses and massage parlours. The police would come in, document our names, trot off, come back and visit us as undercover police officers, arrest us a week later when we had no idea who they were, or let alone what we said to them, for soliciting, take us off to court, stand us up, name and shame, and then we'd get the conviction. And then, of course, to add insult to injury, we weren't allowed to continue working in massage parlours, which was the biggest employer for female sex workers at the time. And we were left with scarcely any choice but to work, and for some of us it was our first choice to be a street-based sex worker. But even so, it was important when the law changed to ensure that sex workers had a range of choices. So today in New Zealand, we have many sex workers who are electing to work for themselves, to manage their own sex work conditions. Of course, we still have people who say, look, I'm happy going to the brothel, I'm happy having a manager, just so long as I can hold her or him in line. And so we have about 40% who are working in the managed part of the sex industry. The rest, street-based sex work, we have about 10%. And that is a huge range of options. The private sector, as we like to refer to it, is mostly resident-based. So we have a lot of sex workers who work from home. And I can't say that the last 11 years have always been easy on that front in terms of debate. It's amazing how many people claim to have the whore next door, or wish they had. We've had a little bit of debate in the local council arena where after the law changed in 2003, local councils were lobbied quite seriously in our major cities by the people who had their noses out of joint, the naysayers, the people who had opposed the Prostitution Reform Act, ganged up on the local body authorities to say, look, you now have the power to zone the location of brothels. And so they fed a lot of the fever into the council that we'd seen in the Parliament prior to the law change. But, you know, common sense does prevail generally, and so for the most part, councils around the country haven't been too draconian. We had to take a couple of them to court for their attitudes, and they created these things called bylaws, which I'm sure you're all familiar with, and they determined the location of brothels in Auckland, for instance, our largest city of 1.5 million people. The Auckland Council decided that it was only possible to have a brothel on a traffic island or thereabouts, you know, words to that effect. So one of the brothels, which had existed as a massage parlour quite happily in this semi-residential neighbourhood, challenged the council, and we supported the challenge, and the Auckland Council had to back down and create a new bylaw. So I think even councils have learned that you have to now look at sex work and the sex industry and brothels and accept that they're there to stay and that you cannot act unreasonably, which was part of the language in terms of the legal challenge, that the council had acted unreasonably. I expect that you have all of these issues and they'll play out once the law changes in Canada in some way. Sex workers have advertising rights, although there are restrictions, and I want to talk about this because I know it's a topical issue. It's very important sex workers can advertise. It's ridiculous to outlaw advertising. People will find other means. I know in the UK, for instance, the people would advertise prior to the internet, of course, and phone boxes, you know, there'd be cards, etc., placed all around. But in New Zealand, we have got a piece of legislation, and it says advertisements for commercial sexual services may not be broadcast on radio or television or published in a newspaper or periodical except in the classified advertisements section of the newspaper. So what you do, you turn to the back of your daily family newspaper, and there you see all the adverts, and they're not explicit because the newspapers themselves come up with their own policies. They don't need legislation to be so prescriptive. They have their own policies, and of course there is censorship law as well to protect and balance out the issues in relation to advertising. So newspapers carry advertisements for sex workers as well as adverts placed by brothels looking to hire sex workers, which is really important. And occasionally you see adverts, boutique brothel, and that'll be in the mainstream newspaper, looking for staff. And I think that's a really important thing as well, because when I was a young thing, fed up with school teaching, looking for a way out to pay my visa bill, you know, and travel more during those school holidays,